So this talk will present some of the findings of the first chapter of my dissertation that I'm currently writing for the Language, Reading, and Culture program in the College of Education. The talk is titled Genres of Testimony and will examine some of the tensions that surround the written testimonies of victims of Nazism. When I began the doctoral studies and people would ask, "What are you studying?" I would say, somewhat reflexively, that I'm studying pedagogical uses of Holocaust survivor testimony. I answered that way because that is the body of testimonial material that is most often used by teachers. However, it's a poor phrasing because it neglects both the writing that was done in the moment during the era of the Third Reich as the events were unfolding by many who did not survive, and another body of testimonial material that I believe is crucial, works that Marianne Hirsch and others refer to as post-memory. And I'll return to these bodies of testimonial material in just a bit. Testimony. This is my primary area of interest. I came to another Duchin lecture here in October, and Max Strassfeld was the presenter, and he said repeatedly, "I'm a Talmudist." I'm a testimonialist, I think. But what is testimony? What does it mean? I use it to mean the act of bearing witness in the most inclusive and expansive sense. There are other more restrictive definitions and frames. For example, Henry Greenspan, in his text titled On Listening to Holocaust Survivors, which has accompanied me as a point of reference through these years of study, he prefers the term recounting to testimony. And he writes that testimony is often associated with judicial and religious contexts and suggests a formal, finished quality that almost never characterizes survivors' remembrances. I agree with Greenspan. Still, I use the word testimony because it is the word that is most commonly used. And his point about finality is particularly important and points to one of many persistent tensions between history and memory. While historical discourse changes and historians are expected to update and revise their work, witnesses are not. In fact, in many instances, these witnesses are judged on the precision of their testimony at the moment it is uttered or written. So for witnesses, revision or editing commonly diminishes the reliability of the testimony in the public eye, as though the memory should come rushing in with exacting specificity at the moment it is called forward. Of course, the Diary of Anne Frank, which is the most widely read testimonial text, was highly edited, many times over, presented in abridged forms, etc. Shoshana Fellman writes that witness testimony locates the possibility of grasping the Holocaust in the slippage between law and art, between the closure brought by legal judgment and the open-ended immediacy and presence preserved in a work of art. So in other words, law circumscribes and art explodes the boundaries and clears the way for new ways of thinking. So the Nuremberg and the successor trials was early work of building the historical record in the courts, feeling out the boundaries, defining the boundaries of the history. And we can consider works like Claude Lanzmann's documentary film Shoah, Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Maus, Peter Eisenman's monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, etc., as pushing new ways of thinking, often controversially through text, film, and monuments. Two distinct bodies of literature have informed my thinking about writing for this chapter. So there's one which is writing about representations of the Holocaust. Here I'm reading scholars such as James Young, Shaul Friedlander, Jeffrey Hartman, David Roskies, Shoshana Fellman, Susan Suleiman, Lawrence Langer, Sarah Horowitz, Marianne Hirsch, and many others. And the second is writing about Holocaust education, specifically writing about how to use testimony in pedagogically sound ways. Surprisingly, there is very little scholarly writing about the particularities of teaching with testimony. So on the one hand, there is essentially a universal agreement that first-person testimony should be used to support teaching about this history. And on the other hand, beyond this acknowledgement, there is shockingly little work to help educators navigate the numerous complexities that surround and in many ways haunt the use of testimony in classrooms. This is somewhat startling as we approach the end of the era of the survivor, and it is precisely why I undertook these doctoral studies, anticipating this moment when the possibility for bringing the living voice of history into the classroom is over, and at the same time these survivors and those who did not survive have bequeathed to the world an enormous trove of testimonial material. So what we find in practice is that many educators treat testimony as a kind of monolithic and homogeneous body of information. They might teach with the Diary of Anne Frank or Elie Wiesel's memoir, Night, as though they are interchangeable. In other words, without considering the deep differences that mark these texts because of the genres through which the active witness is carried through. This research on pedagogical uses of testimony is particularly relevant for the future of Holocaust education because a 2015 study found that in the United States, the Holocaust is most commonly taught in language arts classrooms. In these classrooms, a combination of testimonial texts and historical fiction are the primary texts used to support the teaching. The study also found that the primary pedagogical approach of Holocaust educators is a literary or text-based approach that utilizes novels, poems, or films as the primary media and frame of reference. So Holocaust education is happening more frequently in language arts classrooms than in history classrooms. Education scholars have registered their concern about the likelihood that the historical record and the sizable genre of historical fiction will blur for students in the 21st century. This concern is well-founded, not least of all because of the distinction between testimony and historical fiction. It's not always so cut and dry. My chapter explores various forms of genre, particularly textual forms that have been used to give testimony or bear witness by individuals who experienced persecution during the era of the Third Reich. My aim is to differentiate and in many ways complicate the chorus of testimonial voices toward a recognition of the heterogeneity, the multiplicity of voices and experiences that make up this body of information, so that each and every individual who found the courage to write about their experiences of the extreme are appreciated for their individuality and the singular and unique contribution that they have made to the record of the Shoah. Additionally, my goal is to join with those who have called for an increase in genre awareness in programs of teacher education so that the discussion of genre becomes a more common classroom practice. These discussions of genre support more critical reception of information in general. To talk about testimony and genre is to talk about two other forces that every chapter in my dissertation addresses, that's representation and mediation. Everything that comes between us and the event as it took place. Words, the translation of words, narrative, medium, memory, trauma, discourses, an interlocutor, concerns of the present, and of course our own personal biases are just a few of the primary mediating forces. As I've sifted through this material and continue to dig deeper into the challenges of giving and receiving testimony, I've experienced something like Zeno's dichotomy paradox. Endless possible divisions splitting into ever finer categories of considerations which can have the effect of immobilizing you. But since I'm committed to a May 11th graduation date, that's exactly 109 days from today, I move forward. And I'm specifically looking at genres of life writing. I'm using a definition of life writing as those discourses and practices that construct truth and identity about and pertaining to oneself and one's experience of the world. Life writing places the writer within a specific discourse and allows the reader to similarly situate the writer. Smith and Watson describe life writers as subjects of historically and culturally specific understandings of memory, experience, identity, embodiment, and agency. They both reproduce the various ways in which they have been culturally read and critique the limits of those cultural modes of self-narrating. In their work, Reading Autobiography, Smith and Watson identify 52 genres of life writing. I listed them here. This is not a generic wallpaper. I typed it up and I saw a few typos as I was looking up at that. 52 genres of life writing. So Smith and Watson write that victims are, when they write about one of these 52 genres called survivor narrative, they write, victims are remade as survivors through acts of speaking out, telling their stories in ways that move beyond a concentration on personal feelings and confessional to testimony that critiques larger cultural forces. For survivor narratives, they write, what we need is not to confess, but to witness. So now I'll pull back and not fall into the endless divisions of Zeno's paradox, to consider the impact of genre, and while I've found the possibility for countless divisions, I'm going to focus now on just two: fiction versus nonfiction, and contemporaneous writing versus retrospective writing. This chapter and my thinking about the various modes of expression that have been and continue to be utilized to represent experiences of extremity have grown out of my study of Bakhtin's concept of speech genres. Speech genres. What does this mean? What Bakhtin is talking about is a set of guidelines or conventions that have developed related to specific and recurrent settings or contexts where speech happens. For example, in a doctor's office, or during a rabbi's sermon, or ordering a golden cappuccino at 5 Points Market, or introducing a gallery chat at the Jewish History Museum, or the first session of class in a class at the University of Arizona, or in a kindergarten classroom. There are certain conventions and expectations about what will be said, who will say it, how long it will last, etc. For example, this Duchin lecture falls within a speech genre that we might call academic presentations. There was David's introduction, my thank yous, the way I stand up here and talk to you sitting over there. There will be a question and answer session that will follow, and these are all circumscribed by a set of conventions that allow us to know what to expect and how to behave, and what to say. I've observed hundreds of encounters between Holocaust survivors and students, and I began to consider these encounters as instances where testimony as a speech genre is enacted. Why? Because there are certain conventions, common themes, expectations, there's a typical narrative arc, a whole set of assumptions, and this occurs both on the part of the teller and all those who have gathered to receive the testimony. Okay, so what is genre and what does it do? Genre is a system of classification, among other things. Genre as a system of classification is primarily concerned with form. Genre also has functions that are important to consider as we receive information that has been classified as, for example, a memoir or a novel. Genres draw a line in the sand. They tell us what to do and what not to do. As we enter a text or a speech situation, the experience is often in part predetermined, sometimes overly determined by the conventions of the genre we are entering, unless we either accidentally or intentionally break the rules of the genre. And this, for me, is where things get interesting. In fact, in their introduction to The Power of Literacy, a genre approach to teaching writing, Cope and Calancis state, here I'm quoting, "Those who are really innovative and really powerful are those who break the conventions, not those who reproduce them." I agree, and I have discovered both in my studies and my teachings that those who bear witness in non-conventional ways, those who understand where the line in the sand is drawn and who intentionally transgress that line or wipe it out with the ways they deploy their words, are the most powerful, memorable, complicated, and engaging witnesses. In short, they're the voices, I believe, among those most likely to be remembered. You might think, why does a witness, someone who has experienced dislocation, torture, starvation, forced labor, need to be concerned with the ways they deploy their words as I described it? The answer is because we human beings are storytellers and meaning makers. We can't help but to be influenced by narrative form and technique, and because among the numerous distinguishing qualities of the Holocaust is the following: the first-hand testimonies of victims of Nazi persecution Their written, oral, and video testimony comprises the largest body of material on one event produced by those who experienced it. So there is an abundance of testimonial material. It's a body of information so vast that no one can master it. Take the Shoah Foundation archive of video testimonials at USC, for example. It contains more than 55,000 video testimonies. If each of those videos are 2 hours long, that's 110,000 hours of testimonial footage. If you watch those videos for 24 hours a day, it would take you 4,583 days, 12 and a half years to watch it all. But no one can watch TV, not even the most binge-worthy Netflix series 24/7. So if you were to watch those Shoah Foundation testimonials for 12 hours a day, that would take 9,166 days, 25 years. And at this point, I ask you to consider what would remain salient for the viewer. So again, why does a witness need to be concerned with the ways they deploy their words? Because a primary motivation for telling about these experiences in the first place is so that they will be remembered. Yet so many individuals have given witness that a set of narrative tropes have taken hold. This is what happens with genre. A reader can almost anticipate what is going to happen next and what words might be used to describe it. So the reader is left with a sense of knowing what will come next. And worse, a sense of comfort and complacency. These tellers who defy conventions, who intentionally subvert the norms of the genre, who wipe away the line in the sand, are more likely to be remembered, to be salient. What does it mean to break the rules or conventions of genre? I'll give you a contemporary example, not from the arena of Holocaust history. I really did type that out. I'll also mention one that I read a little bit about each of these 52 genres. One that I thought was very interesting, autobiography, O-U-G-H-T-A. Those are the writings of an individual about all of the things they wish they would have done but never did. Autobiography. Jordan Peele, most well known as a comedian and one half of the comedic duo Key and Peele, he wrote and produced Get Out, a film about American racism, the white gaze, and black terror. And as with much of the most effective works of social commentary, critics really did not know what to do with it. Here's the next page from the New York Times Magazine. Docu-horror thriller comedy about race in America. So you can see the New York Times Magazine struggle to place the film in a particular genre. The Golden Globes created some controversy by nominating this serious film about race in America for an award in the category of musical or comedy. Peele responded by saying the film is a documentary. Social media erupted with questions asking what's so funny about black pain. And in the end, Peele stated, "Call it whatever you'd like, just know it is our truth." This is an example of a highly effective form of cinematic testimony, which is the focus of the second chapter of my dissertation. And I bring it up here because it demonstrates a couple of key points. One is the ways that witnesses can draw attention to the issue event that they are representing by breaking with the conventions of genre. And two, the ways that the genre classification itself is slippery and controversial and impacts our reception of witness representations. I show this example to begin to pull back and reveal the importance of genre, of classification, as an early step in the meaning-making process, and to show how important and fraught the process of establishing genre can be, particularly when dealing with works that address historical injury and suffering. Now I'll share 3 examples from the arena of Holocaust history that underscore the tension between fiction and nonfiction. Mouse is a graphic novel published in 1986, written and illustrated by Art Spiegelman, the son of survivors, which in 1986 came out in a rather unexpected genre, a comic book, though he doesn't like the word comic book. He calls it a comics, C-O-M-I-X, a commixture of words and images. The reason it is unexpected is because of the misleading notions many hold about the genre of comics, that they are humorous, playful, irreverent, when in fact, as Maus proves, they can be quite serious and complicated and can actually do a lot of work on behalf of the witnesses that other genres simply cannot. Another quality of Maus is that it represents an act of post-memory, which I mentioned earlier. Post-memory, these are memories that are mediated not through the recollection of the events themselves, but through imaginative energy and intergenerational recreation. Spiegelman describes Maus, and here I quote, as an autobiographical history of my relationship with my father, a survivor of the Nazi death camps, cast with cartoon animals. When it was published, the book appeared on the New York Times bestseller list under the category of fiction. Spiegelman responded with a letter to the New York Times in which he wrote, in quotes, "To the extent that fiction indicates that a work isn't factual, I feel a bit queasy. As an author, I believe I might have lopped several years off the 13 I devoted to my 2-volume project if I could only have taken a novelist's license while searching for a novelistic structure." Spiegelman continued, "I shudder to think how David Duke, if he could read, would respond to seeing a carefully researched work based closely on my father's memories of life in Hitler's Europe and in the death camps classified as fiction." The Times responded to his letter by relocating Maus over to the nonfiction side of the ledger. Beyond the question of fiction and nonfiction, Maus is built on a constantly shifting narrative landscape, one that moves between biography and autobiography, Vladek's autobiography, Art's biography of his father, the father's and the son's biographies of Vladek's wife, Anya, and throughout Maus, Spiegelman sustains 3 thematic through lines. One is his attempt to tell his father's story, 2 is the story of his reception of that story from his father, and 3, his struggles to represent these stories to the reader through the form of a graphic novel. These are some of the characteristics of post-memory. So here you have an example not of breaking the conventions of genre, but rather Spiegelman deployed a rather unexpected genre for bearing witness to the Shoah, at least it was in the year 1986. Art Spiegelman. Fatelessness was published in 1975. It's a highly autobiographical novel, masterfully crafted by Imre Kertész, a Hungarian survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, about the year he spent as a 16-year-old in these and other Nazi camps. Fatelessness is the only written testimonial of a Holocaust survivor to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Kertész intentionally subverted the narrative traps and cliches that had emerged in the memoirs of Holocaust survivors 30 years after the end of the war by choosing the genre of novel and saturating his novel in irony and a tone of adolescent naivete. While the experiences of the main character in Fatelessness mirror the experiences of Kertész himself, the author frequently denied that the novel was autobiographical at all. Kertész is the best example that I know of one who bears witness by breaking the conventions of genre. Beyond Fatelessness, he wrote another book that resembled a memoir, a book titled K Dossier, which he wrote as an interview where he played both the interviewer and the interviewee. And in this book, he responds to much of the criticism that his approach to bearing witness had received, and he does it on his own terms. Kertész. This is also Kertész, and so is this. Treblinka, The Revolt of an Extermination Camp. This was published in 1966 in France. This text was authored by then 28-year-old Jean-Francois Steiner, and it ignited a major controversy in France. The book hit French readers prior to Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, though in many ways it attempted to do something similar. Steiner, who was born in Paris in 1938, wrote the book in an effort to construct a Jewish identity built on strength and courage, and worked through the shame that he felt through his judgment of Jews as not only passive in the face of their persecution, but also complicit in their own destruction. a position held by some of the leading thinkers on this subject at that time, including Raoul Hilberg and Hannah Arendt. Steiner used survivor testimony as the primary source material in writing his novel about the uprising at Treblinka. This was unusual at that time. He also interviewed 9 survivors and cast them as characters in his novel, a novel that was classified as a nonfiction novel. So he took the survivor testimony and then twisted the narrative to fit his ideological aims of highlighting what he saw as a prevalence of Jewish passivity and complicity and some notable examples of courageous and violent defiance. Treblinka is part of a lineage that includes Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, a book that was published in the same year and is similarly classified as a nonfiction novel. In Cold Blood gave the enterprise of fictionalizing reality a famous name. Treblinka was presented to the public as novelized documentation based scrupulously on Jewish testimony. It is a book that narrates history, but does not pretend to be a book of history, though I think it could easily be mistaken, especially today, as a book of history. And this is precisely why considerations of genre are important. Steiner never insisted that he had written a history, and while he would have rejected the label fiction for his book, he freely admitted that parts had been imagined, in his words, to make the facts speak more truthfully. If you're interested in this controversy, I recommend Samuel Moyn's book about the controversy, titled A Holocaust Controversy. It's published in 2005, A Text About a Text, which creates a whole kind of meta-language that I think is important for wrestling with the complexity of this history. Defying the conventions, especially when the conventions are associated with Holocaust representation, is often controversial. And these controversies are frequently rooted in the anxiety-producing labels of fiction, of novel, of literature, that are activated when these labels of classification are attached to a testimonial text. The labels imply that a creative act was undertaken, and the quality of creativity, unfortunately and quite problematically, undermines the evidentiary charge that testimonials hold. Fiction is often considered synonymous with lies. At the same time, as Maus convincingly demonstrates, the use of the imagination or the artifice of a narrative structure or device often allows for a deep truth to be most effectively conveyed. These controversies are not limited to periodicals and publishing houses. Rather, they are often initiated by survivors, scholars, and artists who themselves are struggling with these questions of representation, wrapped up as they are in questions of ethics. Again, I refer you to Samuel Moyn's chapter in his book, The Holocaust Controversy, titled Revolt of the Survivors, to learn how these survivors, when they learned about what Steiner had done with their testimonies, wrote back quite publicly about what many felt was a breach of ethics and a betrayal. Many of the leading voices in discussions about Holocaust representation have claimed their position on these rather vexed questions of representation and remembrance. Claude Lanzmann claimed that the truth kills the possibility of fiction. Elie Wiesel asserted that a novel about Auschwitz is not a novel, or else it is not about Auschwitz. Kertész, who I already mentioned, won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his novel about Auschwitz, claimed emphatically as recently as 2007 that all testimony to Auschwitz, even the most autobiographical, is fiction. Through this claim, Kertész provocatively makes the point that everything that is mediated through words, narrative structure, and memory is by default a creative act, and as such can be considered a work of fiction. And the historian Yerushalmi, in his 1982 work, Zachor, famously wrote that while the Holocaust has fostered more historical research than any other event in Jewish history, I quote, "I have no doubt whatsoever that its image is being shaped, not at the historian's anvil, but in the novelist's crucible." Another primary break in considerations of testimonial writing about the Holocaust occurs between testimonials that were written during the era of the Third Reich 1933 to 1945, what I call contemporaneously written testimonials. Others have called present-oriented testimonials. And those that were written in the post-war period, what I refer to as retrospective testimonials. I have explored testimonial writing according to this binary that positions the writer as either having done the writing contemporaneously or retrospectively, though further breakdowns among periods of testimonial writing have been articulated. During the era of the Third Reich, there is a division between pre-war writing and writing that occurred during the war. There are further distinctions among wartime diaries between those written before 1942 and those written after, when the genocidal intent of the Nazis became clearer. An even finer temporal and spatial framing distinguishes the lives of Jews in a given city, first during the early days of the German occupation, then during the ghetto period, and then during the period of mass deportation and through liberation. Remember what I said earlier about the possibilities for infinite divisions and splitting. Testimonial writing during the era of the Third Reich occurred individually, in places of solitude and hiding, and collectively as historiography projects that were purposefully designed to capture the urgency of the moment from as many individual perspectives as possible. Emanuel Ringelblum organized the Eunig Shabbos, a necessarily clandestine archive that documented life under the Nazi occupation from within the Warsaw Ghetto. This archive comprised the largest organized writing project in all of occupied Europe. And it was undertaken with the intent to create a vital historical record that would facilitate the work of historians in the future. As Samuel Kasov writes in his book, Who Will Write Our History, Ringelblum understood the need to write from inside the event, writing that would not be skewed by the distorting lens of retrospective recollection and selective memory. David Roskies refers to this real-time archival practice as documentary activism, imbuing the archive with an activist's ethos. Those who participated in the Eunig Shabbos, and there were tens of thousands of people participating, they participated in a historiographical shift from the retrospective tradition of looking back to a new contemporaneous practice of looking around, surveying and collecting events and experiences of the moment. The documents collected in the Eunig Shabbos were written across numerous genres, including poems, formal documentary essays, highly stylized essays, hybridized lamentations, last will and testaments, and they were all written in the moment. Similar archival projects were undertaken in other ghettos, including Łódź, Kovno, and Vilna. As receivers of this material, these testimonies, expressly written for future readers and delivered through the pen with an activist spirit, what responsibilities do we confront as we encounter these voices? The example of these writers as activists offers inspiration for how to courageously defy the forces of persecution in a way that holds promise for future generations. Additionally, the fact of these real-time documentary projects, beyond the rich substance of their contents, refutes notions of Jewish passivity during the war and complicates the limited framework of resistance as explicitly related to armed struggle. Roskies insists that diaries are universally acknowledged to be the core of wartime writing. In the introduction to the diary of Samuel Goldfarb, the editors at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum asserted that diaries are among the most powerful sources penned by victims of the Nazi genocidal onslaught as it ravaged Europe. Lawrence Langer adds that the most detailed records of Jewish existence during the Holocaust are to be found in archives and chronicles from the ghettos. This is the genre of a diary. Diaries were written by hundreds and perhaps thousands of Jewish people in various languages and from within various national and wartime contexts. These texts provide a glimpse inside the wartime experiences of victims of Nazism and form one dimension of their responses to persecution. Diaries comprise a critical body of source material that holds an evidentiary value that allows later generations of readers to forge intimate understandings of the experiences of persecution while working against the erasure of genocidal violence. Had these individuals not written their experiences down in real time, the only view we would have into the daily life of those who were incarcerated in the ghettos would be filtered through the lens of Nazi propaganda films, the bureaucratic, coded, and euphemistic jargon of the perpetrators, and the imperfect memories of those who survived. Letters are another genre of contemporaneously written materials, testimonials. Most literary scholars acknowledge the close relation between diaries and letters, and yet mark a distinction between these two modes of writing. A primary distinction between these two genres is the intended audience. Diaries are often written as a conversation with oneself, while letters are written to absent others. But the circumstances of World War II, marked as all instances of totalitarian rule, are, by severity and limited possibilities for open dialogue and expression, led to an increased blurring of the diary with the epistolary form of writing. So parents wrote extended letters to their absent children in their diaries to carry on with the duties of parenting, and because mailing actual letters was often too hazardous. And children wrote letters to their absent parents in their diaries in order to maintain a conversational link with their parents. The ambiguity surrounding the receptivity of the addressee is another quality that imbues these contemporaneous forms of writing with an urgency and intimacy that is qualitatively different from the writings written retrospectively, though a degree of uncertainty surrounds the reception of all testimonials, regardless of when and where they are articulated. Diaries, letters, and other modes of contemporaneously written testimonials hold the extreme mark of the moment. These documents written from inside the event are the only genres of writing in which the reader knows more about what will take place than the writer. Beyond the closed canon of contemporaneously written testimonials are all of the witness accounts that came after. It's an open and unending canon, characterized by numerous qualities that distinguish it from all that was written while the events of the war were going on. While those who wrote contemporaneously did so under the pressures of the war and the relentless hunt and murder of the Jewish people, those who wrote and continue to write retrospectively do so under the influence of different kinds of pressures. For example, the force of post-war national and political discourses and the power of deeply embedded narrative structures significantly shape the testimonies that are articulated in retrospect. The position and vision of the witness writer who is writing from within the event, a position of urgent immediacy, is altogether different from the survivor witness who tells from the retrospective position. The scholar Sarah Horowitz wrote, "The reality that unfolds in the diaries and chronicles yields a vision of Jewish existence more varied than the one emerging from retrospective survivor accounts. Those who wrote their testimonies while incarcerated in the ghettos or from within places of hiding did so before they and their experiences were mythologized in the post-war era. And the emergent post-war mythologies have a discernible effect on the narrative shape of survivor testimonies." So to close, I'm going to invite Rabbi Aaron to read a short passage from a testimonial text titled Yizkor 1943 that was written by Rachel Auerbach, who worked closely with Emanuel Ringelblum. There's Ringelblum, and there's Auerbach. She worked closely with Emanuel Ringelblum on the Oyneg Shabbos archive. She survived. She helped to recover part of the archive from its place buried under the streets of Warsaw. And she later became the first director of the testimonial archive at Yad Vashem. Auerbach wrote Yizkor 1943 in a place of hiding after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the destruction of the ghetto 75 years ago.
What madness is it that drives one to list the various kinds of Jews who were destroyed? Grandfathers and grandmothers with an abundance of grandchildren, with hands like withered leaves, their heads white, who already trembled at the latter end of their days. They were not destined simply to decline wearily into their graves like rest-seeking souls, like the sun sinking wearily into the ocean's waves. No, it was decreed that before they died, they would get to see the destruction of all they had begotten, of all they had built. The decree against the children and the aged was more complete and more terrible than any. Those who counted and those who counted for less. Those with aptitudes developed carefully over countless generations, incomparable talents, richly endowed with wisdom and professional skill, doctors, professors, musicians, painters, architects, and Jewish craftsmen, tailors, famous and sought after, Jewish watchmakers in whom Gentiles had confidence, Jewish cabinet makers, printers, bakers, the great proletariat of Warsaw. Or shall I console myself with the fact that for the most part, you managed to die of hunger and need in the ghetto before the expulsion? Ah, the ways of Warsaw, the black soil of Jewish Warsaw.